Hypnosis has a long and controversial history, from its links to the occult and mind control, and its portrayal in fiction, often involving an evil hypnotist, through to its ability to be used to reduce pain, to give people greater control over their bodily functions and increase the effectiveness of therapies to overcome emotional and psychological problems. In this series, we will cover the story of hypnosis, from its ancient past through to mesmerism in the 1700s, on to the creation of hypnotism in the mid-1800s, into the early research era, and on to hypnosis in the present day. We will end the series exploring the dark side of hypnosis and how hypnosis has been portrayed in fiction. In this episode, we'll explore the world of mesmerism, from its development within the scientific era through to approaches being used by healers around the time mesmerism first appeared, to the creation, spread, and downfall of mesmerism. Since the dawn of the scientific era in the mid-1500s, which was built upon aspects of Greek, Roman and Islamic science, among others, people began to focus on trying to understand the world around them in a measurable and evidenced way. If something couldn't be understood, they didn't want to just attribute it to a higher power of some kind. They wanted to explore it and figure it out. As well as this move to understand the physical world in a new way, there was a move to understand humans and life, with the development of modern neurology beginning in the 1500s and psychiatry following in the 1600s. One of the earliest psychiatric books was The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton in 1621. And the 1700s, William Batty wrote his Treatise on Madness in 1758, helping to advance the view that those experiencing mental illness should be treated with compassion and helped. This was likely progressed further along in the late 1700s, when the King of England, George III, was experiencing mental illness, likely due to poisoning from products that he was ingesting containing arsenic, which was detected in high levels in samples of his hair examined in 2005. He had experienced mental illness in the 1760s and again in the 1780s. A high-profile person like the King of England experiencing mental illness and going away for a time to recover and seeming to have gotten better may have encouraged people to see mental illness as something that can be cured or at least treated to some extent. In the early 1770s, a Jesuit priest, Father Gassner, was curing people through exorcisms. Gassner is often touted as the likely root of modern hypnosis, rather than the more famous Franz Anton Mesmer. "Kneel before me," Gassner told a nun. He asked her name and for a brief description of the presenting illness. "Do you agree to do anything I order?" he continued. The nun responded affirmatively. In Latin, Gassner continued, "If there be anything preternatural about the disease, I order in the name of Jesus that it manifest itself immediately." At this point, the nun began to have convulsions, which Gassner took to be proof that this illness was caused by an evil spirit rather than a natural illness. Gassner continued in Latin to order that the spirit creates convulsions in various named parts of the body. Once this was followed, he ordered that the patient manifests stillness, grief, anger, and various other emotions and states. Once he had demonstrated his power over the evil spirit, with all of his suggestions being followed, demonstrating that he had tamed the spirit, he commanded that the spirit leave the patient's body, and the patient was healed of their ailment. Gassner had started his cures a few years earlier than Mesmer, and they had more in common with what would become hypnosis. But Gassner claimed supernatural reasons for his cures. He was casting out evil spirits, whereas when Mesmer appeared on the scene, he was trying to explain what he was doing from a scientific perspective, although Mesmer clung on to the idea that what he was doing involved something physical and wouldn't entertain the idea that it could be psychological. In 1775, Mesmer was asked to demonstrate his abilities before the Academy of Sciences in Munich. He successfully did this and was subsequently asked for his opinion on what Gassner was doing. Mesmer said that Gassner may well have greater powers of magnetism than he himself possessed, and was, without his own knowledge, using these powers to cure his patients. Following what Mesmer said, the Church, who had been looking for a reason for banning Gassner due to his unorthodox ways of working, had Gassner banned from practicing. He died in obscurity 4 years later, and has remained relatively unknown in the story of hypnosis ever since. Franz Anton Mesmer was the first to have a go at developing a scientific mind-body healing approach. Mesmer was born in 1734. Aged 26, Mesmer began studying medicine at the University of Vienna. Mesmer's dissertation was on the influence of the planets. It was an attempt to bring the gravitational effects of the movement of the planets on the human body into medicine. The thinking was that if gravity can create the tides, then perhaps it can have an influence on the human body and may be linked to illness through a universal fluid. His dissertation was largely plagiarized from the works of English physician Richard Mead, who proposed a similar theory back in 1704. After leaving university, Mesmer set up a medical practice. In 1773, a young woman living with Mesmer was experiencing a cyclical illness. Mesmer realized that he was able to predict when her next attack of the illness would strike. To this point, he had been unable to cure her, only offer her temporary relief through the means of normal medicine. He felt that the cyclical nature of the illness was the perfect example of his theory proposed in his dissertation. The treatment, he felt, would be found in the discovery of some kind of substance which would enable him to control the ebb and flow of the universal fluid being influenced by the gravitational effects. Mesmer thought that magnets might be the answer, as magnets can attract and repel, similar to the way gravity seems to influence things. In July 1774, when the patient's next attack of her illness struck, he decided to try to treat her with magnets. When my patient had another attack, Mesmer wrote, I fixed 2 horseshoe magnets to her feet and another in the shape of a heart on her breast. Immediately, she felt a burning, tearing pain which spread up her legs as far as her hips, where it was joined by a similar pain which descended from the magnets on her breast down one side and up the other to the crown of her head. As these pains dissipated, they left all her joints burning like fire. The pain continued throughout the night. The symptoms gradually disappeared. She became insensitive to the action of the magnets, and the seizures were over. Mesmer repeated this treatment over the coming days and weeks and found that he was able to direct the symptoms with the magnets as if the magnets were having an effect on the universal fluid within the patient's body, and that over time the symptoms reduced. Mesmer kept the supplier of the magnets, Maximilian Hell, who was also working on magnetic cures, informed of his progress. Hell beat Mesmer to the publication of an article about the use of magnets for treating illness. If that had become the dominant knowledge, then maybe we would be talking about Hellism rather than Mesmerism. Hell claimed that he had suggested the idea of using magnets to Mesmer. Hell felt that the shape of the magnets was important, whereas Mesmer felt that it wasn't. Mesmer thought of the magnets as just being a conductor of the universal fluid within the body, what he termed animal magnetism. Within a year, Mesmer had concluded that different objects could be magnetized. He had so many people coming to see him for treatment that he would magnetize tubs of iron filings, or pass his animal magnetism into trees. He would carry out cures, like having someone touching a magnetized tree, and that person would hold hands with the person next to them, and that person to another person, and so on, with a chain of connected people holding hands to the person touching the tree. He would then touch one of the people with a glass pole to spread his animal magnetism into the people. Patients would convulse and seizure, and many would leave apparently cured. Mesmer quickly progressed from here to believing no objects were required, that it was possible to transfer personal animal magnetism into people, even from a distance. He would sometimes just look at a patient and raise a hand in a meaningful looking way, and that would be enough for the person to convulse and be cured. When working one-to-one with patients, Mesmer would sit very close opposite the person, with his knees on the outside of the patient's knees. He would stroke the patient's body, often their shoulders, down their arms, to their hands, holding their thumbs for a moment before repeating this. Sometimes he would stroke all the way down to the feet, sometimes touching exposed skin or holding parts of the person's body. Other times, the passes would be close to the patient's body, but not actually touching. Sometimes he would touch the patient's stomach and lower back as a way of channeling the magnetic fluid into the patient's whole body. These treatments were often dramatic. There appeared to be a lot of showmanship and flair. Mesmer was moving in the direction of working more psychologically, using communication that was more about focusing and absorbing attention and increasing responsiveness, involving expectation and the imagination. But he never publicly admitted this. He continued to push the explanation that it was to do with a real physical substance. He progressed from using magnets to magnetizing objects, turning them into instruments of healing, then moving on to believing he contained enough magnetic fluid that he could heal people with his touch, then with passes of his hands over people, then by speaking with authority. Despite this shift from magnets to any object, to not needing an object and instead using physical touch, and then hand passes and on to speaking authoritatively, he seemed to cling to his theories rather than change his views, despite being presented with evidence that was pointing towards magnetism and objects being unnecessary, that the same results could be achieved through communication between the therapist and the patient. In part 2, we'll explore how this refusal to progress his theories was to be his undoing, and how mesmerism developed in the wake of this. Mesmer's approach became known as mesmerism. Although the medical establishment generally felt Mesmer was a charlatan, his dramatic cures and reports of trances that people entered during his magnetic therapy attracted many followers. There were some people who claimed Mesmer was in the same league as faith healers. Others felt the mesmeric trance state was the same trance as occult practitioners entered. Mesmer argued vehemently against this, trying to push what he saw as a scientific theory rather than it being a supernatural theory of what he was doing. As mesmerism increased in popularity, it began to follow two paths: a scientific path which continued on to the development of hypnosis and psychotherapy, and an occult path which maintained its mesmerism roots. And many of the practices have continued even through to present times. with people using specific trance-inducing practices to access supernatural abilities. Unfortunately, with the dramatic image of mesmerism, with practitioners portrayed as controlling and forceful, asserting their will over people, creating convulsions and spectacular trance responses in patients, frequently in whole groups, and its growing use by occult practitioners, the public came to develop uncertainty and fear in the power of mesmerists, or, following the debunking of Mesmer's theories, and thus the idea that mesmerism was seen as debunked, they believed that anyone doing mesmerism must be a charlatan. This perspective has carried over from mesmerism into hypnotism to this day. It is common, despite decades of research to the contrary, to encounter people who believe hypnosis is fake. And it is still also common to find people who believe hypnosis is real, but who are scared of it, believe it to be about someone asserting their will over others, with people being powerless to resist, or that it is somehow connected with the occult, with people mistakenly claiming that hypnosis puts you into a trance that lets evil spirits through. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin was called in, and a commission was set up to investigate mesmerism and the claims made about how it worked. The commission concluded that there was no magnetic fluid, that when patients could see what was being magnetized, they experienced some effect. But when they couldn't see what had been magnetized, they experienced no effect. So there can't be any magnetic fluid, because they should have had the same experience, whether they were looking or not. This appeared to discredit Mesmer and claim mesmerism was nonsense, but it didn't address the fact that many people had been cured, and that many people experienced effects. All they had done was prove that Mesmer's theories were incorrect. One of Mesmer's students, the Marquis de Puysegur, didn't get as much recognition or credit as he perhaps should, although his approach was gaining popularity at the time when Mesmer's approach had been discredited. His view was that the power resided within the patient, and that it was more about the patient's belief and their wanting success that led to the mesmeric trance state, and that there were other ways of inducing it rather than through animal magnetism. Puysegur disliked the violent, convulsive reactions of patients during treatment by Mesmer. He felt that it must be possible to keep someone calm during the process. He decided to try this with his next patients. While working with them, when he noticed them starting to get worked up, he diverted their attention to lighter themes as a way of keeping them in a pleasant state during treatment. Puysegur seemed to have a great ability to build a deep rapport with his patients, so they became hyper-responsive to his communication. He shared about a client spontaneously singing songs he was mentally rehearsing in his own mind, or answering questions he had thought but not asked. This was something that about 130 years later, the famous hypnotherapist Milton Erickson was just beginning to explore as a teenager, which he called subliminal auditory stimulation, and used to use therapeutically and for doing hypnosis. Puysegur interpreted it as being a telepathic ability, whereas 130 years later, Erickson recognized that people have greater potential than they realize to pick up on and respond to non-conscious communication. Puysegur felt that the state his patients entered was different to that of Mesmer's patients. He termed this state Synabolism, a state where people appeared to be asleep, yet they had these incredible abilities, like being telepathic. They communicated as if they were wide awake and alert, yet the person communicating often had a different quality to them to the person outside of this state. They also frequently reported amnesia for what was occurring within the somnambulistic state. Not everyone was able to be guided into somnambulism. Some people would just become relaxed and sleepy, but Pussegur's aim was to try to get people into this state. Pussegur's approach became popular as somnambulists sprung up in place of mesmerists, but because of Pussegur's focus on interpreting what he saw in somnambulistic patients as being paranormal abilities, the medical community didn't take his work seriously. Somnambulists used more suggestions towards changes they would want or expect to see made and used by the client. They used to use post-hypnotic suggestions by suggesting things would happen in the future, rather than it being all about what is happening in the session. They would send patients away with suggestions that something will happen, that either they give or they elicit from the patient, like at 7 p.m. on Friday, you'll have a related discharge from your nose and this problem will clear up. And it seems from reading the literature that there was a lot of discharges in the late 1700s, early 1800s. Then, at the time that the patient would have a discharge, they would find they no longer have their problem. Another mesmerist of the time was Abbe Ferreira. Ferreira was a Portuguese priest who took a very different approach to mesmerism than other mesmerists of the early 1800s. He recognised that what was important was expectancy and the patient's cooperation. It wasn't about the mesmerist or about magnetic fluid or willpower against a patient, but about grabbing attention, creating expectancy, engaging cooperation. Ferreira believed that it was the mesmerist's suggestions and behaviours which led to the development of the mesmeric trance, not animal magnetism. Ferreira had stage presence to rival Mesmer's. He was more like a stage hypnotist. He would elicit hypnotic phenomena like hallucinations, amnesia, analgesia on stage, as well as other effects you would likely see at a modern hypnosis show. He used a mesmeric gaze to capture and hold attention, as well as giving firm commands. Eventually, an actor attended one of his shows and pretended to respond to his lucid sleep, as Ferreira termed it. And then, at the height of the routine, he jumped up and declared he wasn't in the lucid sleep. He had been playing along the whole time. Like Mesmer, Ferreira was declared a charlatan, and as such, hasn't become as well known as he deserves. Ferreira's approach was probably the closest to what modern-day hypnotists would be familiar with doing. He would start by reciting a script to the subject. The script was described as remarkable for its obscurity. At the end of the script, he would look at the subject and in a commanding voice, he would say the word sleep. If necessary, he would say sleep a few more times. Ferreira's approach induced lucid sleep in half his subjects in under 1 minute. For those people that it didn't work with, his next process would be to have the subject gaze at his hand. He would then move his hand close to the face until they closed their eyes and entered the lucid sleep. Then, for those this didn't work for, he would give a light touch on their head, temples, nose, diaphragm, heart, knees and feet, and for most this would provoke sufficient concentration. In the 1830s, mesmerism began to spread from Europe into the UK and the USA. Dr. John Elliotson was one of the most respected physicians in London. Elliotson was always on the forefront of testing new techniques and therapies, so when he encountered mesmerism, he began to test this with patients and quickly began to give demonstrations and lectures to large audiences of interested students and visitors. Many of his colleagues were unhappy with his behaviour. the University Medical Committee banned the demonstrating and use of mesmerism from its hospital wards and lecture theatre. Eventually, Elliotson reasserted his authority as a well-respected professor at the university to carry out mesmerism research. Unfortunately, he clung to the theories about animal magnetism, believing that it was far more likely to be based on something tangible like electricity and magnetism than on some mystical notion about the power of the mind. He felt that many of these forces were unseen and yet real and testable, and far more plausible. Unfortunately, this clinging to a theory which had already been discredited didn't help him gain scientific credibility for mesmerism. By the late 1830s, mesmerism had spread through the UK. There were many lay mesmerists espousing its health benefits and making wild and miraculous claims about its effects and what it could treat, at a time when mainstream science had moved on from what was viewed to be a discredited practice. This is still a problem today, that there are lay hypnotists making often miraculous claims about hypnosis, its effects, what it can treat and how it works, with little to no basis on the science. And just like with mesmerism, this negatively impacts on hypnosis developing and maintaining an image of legitimacy. A follower of Elliotson's work and reader of books on the subject of mesmerism was a Scottish surgeon, Dr. James Esdaile. While in India during the late 1830s and 1840s, Esdaile performed over 3,000 operations with mesmerism as the anaesthesia. At the time, post-operative survival rates of surgery was around 50%. Esdaile's patients had a survival rate of around 95%. They also recovered quicker and rarely had post-operative shock. Esdaile struggled to gain traction with promoting mesmerism as a useful way of managing pain control and treating problems, despite his high level of success. Part of this struggle was due to doing mesmerism, which had a bad reputation as something charlatans did, and the medical community treated it as a debunked practice. Another issue was that he was doing surgery on poor Indians, and so Indians' upper castes didn't want to see him for surgery, and colonial British didn't want to see him for surgery. The third reason behind the struggles to raise awareness of the benefit of using mesmerism for pain control during operations was that at the same time ether, chloroform and nitrous oxide had come into use. Esdaile believed that one of the most important aspects of what he was doing was having a high level of rapport with his patients and conveying his confidence and belief in what he was doing and the success he expected to achieve. In the USA, people like John Dodds was among the first to practice mesmerism. Dodds used a technique of holding a coin or other metal item in front of the subject and having them gaze at it, and they would enter a mesmeric trance. Dodds theorized that the metal was having some influence on the subject, and eventually this was termed electrobiology. It didn't occur to Dodds that patients were entering the mesmeric trance due to having their attention held on the coin, and this narrow focus of attention was what was behind the development of the trance. But it was around this time, at the beginning of the 1840s, that a Scottish surgeon, James Braid, was about to share his ideas and give birth to the name hypnotism. Prior to Braid, people generally viewed mesmerism as either animal magnetism, which had been debunked, or fraud conducted by charlatans. There were a few people who had begun to develop the idea of suggestion and the imagination being involved in what was occurring, but it took Braid to formulate this view, and that's what we'll cover in the next episode, continuing on the story of hypnosis from Braid to modern hypnotism.